Earwig and the Witch, out on HBO now, new animated film from Studio Ghibli, and the first feature film in the history of this Japanese studio to be made in CG instead of hand-drawn animation. It's based on a novel by Diana Wynne Jones and directed by Goro Miyazaki. When the film was first announced, there was a lot of concern among the fans of Studio Ghibli on the internet. After all, the previous works of the studio, including titles such as Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, or My Neighbor Totoro, and many, many others, were all uniquely beautiful in large part due to their gorgeous drawings. So there was an open question then. Isn't switching to CG getting rid of one of the key strengths of the studio that the studio was known for? And perhaps more importantly, can this look good in CG when the animators perhaps have very little experience in it? Well, now the film is out and we have the answers to those questions. And I'm afraid that the main takeaway is that this is a totally failed experiment. It's a film that not only is the worst in the entire Ghibli catalog for me by far, it is also one of the worst animated movies I've seen in my life. I'll start with the animation style. It is disgusting. The characters are ugly, the locations and sets lifeless and bland, the special effects awful, the way that the people in this film move is stiff and artificial. Honestly, just take a look at the trailer. It basically looks like a cereal commercial from 2005. I think it's inexcusable for a feature film, for a professional feature film, to look this bad in 2021. I mean, in a vacuum, it is terrible. But then if you try to compare it to one of the recent works of Pixar, Disney, even DreamWorks, the stuff that those studios are able to do with CG animation these days, it is just embarrassing that someone greenlighted this. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the problems. The animation style was always one of the two fundamental strengths of Studio Ghibli movies, and the other one was the stories, the characters and the worlds created in those films. These movies, particularly ones directed by Hayao Miyazaki, Goro's father, are always magical in a way that I think no other people can truly replicate. This one is not. The story feels somehow pedestrian and unexciting, and I do think that most of it is on the novel itself, but I do also believe that there was potential in the story, as is, to be somewhat endearing or charming at least, but the way it is executed, adapted to screen, it makes it just very lifeless. So the plot is that in the opening we see a red-haired woman on a motorbike deliver an infant child to an orphanage. She leaves a note saying that the child's name is Earwig and that the woman is being chased by the other 12 witches and has to leave the baby there for its own safety. She then promises to return in some years once the trouble is dealt with, once it's safe again. And we then skip several years ahead. Earwig is now about, I don't know, 8 years old probably, and she's adopted by this weird couple. And as it quickly turns out, she's a witch who needs a helper slash apprentice, and he's a sort of demon wizard called Mandrake. And thus, Earwig begins to live her life in the home of the witch, trying to keep up with her chores and learn some magic of her own. Now, you may expect that after this prologue, which I just explained, at some point the other witches come into play. Who was the witch at the beginning? What is the significance of Earwig? Who was she as a baby? What's the whole plot about? Let me save you some time and just straight up say that it never comes up again. None of it. The redhead lady just shows up at the end without an explanation. But other than that, it seems like it's sequel bait for a sequel that was never actually written. I mean, what's up with that? Watching this film, put it this way, watching this film is like watching the first Harry Potter movie, where we see him dropped off at the beginning, right? We see him live with the Dursleys for some time, and then he never gets the letter from Hogwarts. And the whole movie is just him washing the dishes and sweeping the place. What the ever flying fuck is this? I mean, it is bafflingly awful in terms of storytelling. But okay, even if we pretend that that prologue is not there and the movie doesn't promise some exciting, grander story that never actually happens, even if we do that, the film is still pretty goddamn boring. And I mean, there are traces of movies like Howl's Moving Castle and Kiki's Delivery Service and Coraline here, especially Kiki's Delivery Service for me. It is itself a very uneventful story. It has low stakes and focuses on everyday adventures of a slightly magical girl who's kind of a witch, has a talking cat. So there are similarities here. And yet, in that case, it's just pleasant to spend time in that world because it's beautiful. And it's great to hang around with the characters. In the case of Earwig, the main character, is so fucking annoying. She's just a brat that keeps demanding attention and doesn't listen to adults and is just unbearably infuriating all the way through. And here's the worst part. You would expect at one point she suffers for it and changes for the better, learns some kind of lesson so that, the children watching it also take something away from the movie. But that's not what happens. In the climax of the film, she fucks up and causes a mess, but then ends up never apologizing for it or even fully owning it up. And instead, the dynamic suddenly shifts so that the foster parents become more lenient and easygoing for her, indulging on all of her bullshit. Honestly, it just makes me angry thinking about it again. I truly think that the film as a whole, on all levels of storytelling and technical aspects, it's a stain on the legacy of Studio Ghibli. One can only hope that this was a singular misstep and they will return to what we all know and love. Traditionally drawn 2D animated movies filled with fantasy, magic, and lovable characters.